In the previous episode, we talked about evolution from fins to feet and the iconic image of the first tetrapods crawling out of the water and adapting to life on land. This happened nearly 360 million years ago. We know because there's several fossil species from that time with the ability to crawl out of the water, and some of them in an apparent sequence. And of course, all terrestrial vertebrate fossils appear only after that. This takes us from the Devonian period, also known as the Age of Fishes, to the early Carboniferous period, so named because that's where most of our coal comes from, due to some unique conditions at that time. Plants have been on land for at least 470 million years, since the early Ordovician. At the dawn of the Carboniferous, there were forests of ferns and even a few seed-bearing plants, among unfamiliar forms of flora and fungi that have no living descendants and that no one has ever seen alive. So these primitive forests would have looked like an alien world. But this is our setting for today's lesson in paleohistory. When the first vertebrates crawled out onto the land, they didn't have the place to themselves. There were already a variety of arthropods there, including cockroaches the size of hamburger patties. You could make a sandwich out of one bug. There were also giant scorpions, big ones, and scorpion-like things, and the ancestors of spiders, as well as something like a scorpion spider that was as big as today's coconut crabs. But don't worry, the scorpions won't seem so bad once you see the size of the millipedes. Imagine encountering a bug that is bigger than you are. There were insects around too, including some griffin flies, similar to modern dragonflies, and they got pretty big as well, the biggest flying insects ever. And they were bitey too, big enough to take a bite out of you. But at least there's no ants or mosquitoes yet, so there's that. Into this world come the first tetrapods, four-legged vertebrates that are skeletally adapted for life on dry land. Because evolutionary phylogenies are monophyletic, anything that descended from a tetrapod is a tetrapod, even if it no longer has four legs. For example, whales, manatees, and snakes are all still tetrapods because they descend from tetrapods. So whatever clade you descend from is what you still are. A tetrapoda includes more than just mammals and reptiles, and there are also amphibians, true amphibians, and transitional forms that look like amphibians, things like urops, for example. I had a toy of one of these as a kid. If they were still alive today, I could just see my wife walking one around on a leash. The Carboniferous period is sometimes known as the Age of Amphibians, because whether they were technically amphibians or not, all the early tetrapods would have looked to us like salamanders or something superficially similar to salamanders, meaning that they wouldn't have scales or claws, but they would have that semi-permeable skin that needs high humidity or else it'll dry out. And doubtless these early forms would have reproduced like amphibians too. Their eggs were gelatinous and had to be laid at the water's edge, and the male had to be there to fertilize the eggs as they come out. These are amphibian traits, and there seems to be a natural progression from fish to amphibians that start out looking like fish, having to live in the water until they develop legs. Their internal gills become external gill fronds, and then most of them lose their gills when they transition out of the water and onto the land. Now, for that reason, some people count ichthyostega and everything between that and amniotes as if they're all amphibians. But there are a list of criteria to be amphibian. Most of these earlier forms had some of those traits, but none of them are yet known to have all of them. Technically, true amphibians are only those within the clade Lysamphibia. That's this group right here. Notice that they are not in our ancestral lineage, but on a side branch, because the first frogs and toads, newts and salamanders, and worm-like Sicilians don't show up in the fossil record until the Triassic period, long after their lineage split from ours. Although, if you're looking for a transitional species, we do have a sort of proto-frog, also known as a frogamander, that appears in the Permian period, before the era of the dinosaurs. Gerobactrachus wasn't a complete frog, but it was nearly there. It wasn't ready to hop yet, but almost. It still had a tail, like a salamander, but only a small one. In another 50 million years, the tail would be completely gone, and there would be true hopping frogs. Everyone knows what newts and salamanders, frogs and toads look like, collectively known as the clade Batrachia. But you may not be familiar with another group of living amphibians just outside of that, called Sicilians. There are a couple hundred species of these worm-like amphibians, but you can tell that they're not worms if you take a closer look.
Never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line!
Not all of them look like worms, though. Some of them look like something else. And while I expect to have at least 4 videos just on the evolution of fish, and I already have several on different sets of mammals, I wasn't going to do one on amphibians because even though there are like 8,000 species of them alive today, 90% of them are frogs. They're all quite diverse and many of them are beautiful and all that. It's just that they're not that interesting to me personally. There's another group that are adjacent to amphibians, maybe even ancestral to them, certainly closer to them than anything else, and those are Temnospondyls. These are one of the clades that make the Carboniferous and Permian periods seem so alien and yet strangely familiar at the same time. They were not all like salamanders. Some of them had thicker, tougher, drier skin, like the skin of toads as compared to frogs. Thus, some of them were terrestrial hunters, and not little ones either. And back then they got as big as bears. And a lot of them were like this world's version of alligators. I want to give you an idea how big the fossil record is by looking at how diverse the Temnospondyl order is. Remember, everything listed here is extinct. Wikipedia doesn't always have full cladograms. Something is always missing, and not all of these listed are individual species either. Some are much larger categories. For example, we'll scroll down to the clade Stereospondyli. These are the subclades. Let's open this one, and Neostereospondyli, and then open Capitasauria. Then we'll go to the bottom of these subgroups and choose Mastodonsauroidea, and the taxonomic family Mastodonsauridae. These are how many genera are found just within that one family. Now let's choose the namesake genus Mastodonsaurus. We got 3 species of those, and look at them. Look at the size of it. This is what you get when you try to make an alligator out of a salamander. This is not even the biggest one. This world had quasi-amphibian crocodiles too. Prionosuchus was the largest of these. At 18 feet or more, it's longer than most crocs. Imagine being swallowed by a newt. How embarrassing would that be? There are some scientists who argue that Temnospondyls might be ancestral to Lis amphibia and therefore could be amphibians too. But other paleontologists say that when they compare and consider all the subtle traits that they have to evaluate of all these things, then they think that Temnospondyls are basal to both amphibians, true amphibians, and also to amniotes like us, but as a side branch off of our lineage. That's one of the things that makes an intermediate species transitional, when even the experts can't be certain which side of whatever line it's supposed to be on, because these typically have a mix of traits. I've heard it said that every species is transitional, but that's only potentially so. To be transitional, it must be intermediate, typically between an apparent ancestral form and a possible descendant derivation. To illustrate that, let's look at all the transitional tetrapodomorphs that began as what we would call fish, leading to the crown or beginning of tetrapoda. Then we have a split where amniotes like us are on one side and amphibians are on the other. Aha, but it's not just amphibians, is it? It's all these other almost amphibians as well. Most of them count as transitional forms too, even these snake-like ones. These are not Sicilians. These are more primitive, almost like eels, since they probably still had gills, but they're also quasi-amphibious like the rest of these. They're not the only ones like that either. There was another clade of Carboniferous proto-quasi-amphibian types called Lysirophia that also adopted the snake shape independent of other snaky forms. Just like today, we have worms that are not worms, and we have snakes that are not snakes. You know, Genesis 3 tells the just so story of how the snake lost its legs. When God cursed the serpent so that his descendants, the snakes, would have to crawl on their bellies all of their lives and have enmity with the children of men, with the snakes striking our heels and us striking their heads. God said that snakes were cursed above all other animals for this. But we also have legless lizards and Sicilians and, of course, actual worms. But then we also have Adilospondylls, Astopods, and Lysirophians. This is a simplified cladogram. These are not as closely related as they appear here. There's a lot missing out of this, several clades of things you've never heard of that were left out of this depiction. Since most everything back then looked superficially salamander, this chart omitted most of those and included only a few highlighted groups, things that look distinctly different. Things like Diplocaulus. This thing stands out, doesn't it? Why did it have a V-shaped boomerang head? One study showed that the wingtips actually provide lift, which would make swimming easier, so maybe that's it, but that seems a stretch. Having this head shape would make it impossible to be swallowed by a snake, but there were no snakes around then. And things that only look like snakes don't eat like snakes. All the pseudo-snakes alive today eat by taking bites. The pseudo-snakes that lived back then were too small to make the attempt, so that's not likely it either. Of course, it might be that maybe Diplocaulus didn't look like that at all. Maybe it looked like this. But even if that was true, that still doesn't explain why. Not everything in this cladogram is in the right place either. I could show a composite cladogram where I make all the necessary corrections like I usually do in these type videos, but in this case there is too much to fix. And partly because there was so much confusion among the early scientists in trying to figure it all out. Later scientists come in and find something that doesn't fit that, and maybe it's this way. And sometimes they make up a name for one group that turns out to be 3 different groups. That's actually the beauty of science, that it is self-correcting. Correcting mistakes is the only way to improve. If you can't or won't correct your errors, then you'll never get any better. The way we classify these now is that all the tetrapods we have today can be divided into just 2 groups, amphibians and amniotes, or more appropriately, the reverse, amniotes and everything else. So from that division, this side leads to amphibians, and this side leads to amniotes, which means that all these earlier tetrapods are not amphibians. Now, what is an amniote? There are a handful of significant differences between an amphibian, like a salamander, and an amniote, like a lizard. First, the skin is dry, keeping the moisture inside. That means keratinized skin, which is better even in the water than what amphibians have. If there are toxic pollutants in the water, salamanders will absorb that through our skin. Lizards don't have that problem. Neither do we. The only permeable part of our skin is our lips, and our lips. With dry skin comes other significant adaptations, like scales or dermal nodes, sometimes even spikes or horns, as well as claws. These are all caused by keratin being overloaded in one place or another, and natural selection sorting out where the best places for that are. What you end up with is a form that most people would consider a reptile, whether it is or not, where most people would consider all these other things amphibians, whether they are or not. And the most important difference between them is the egg. And this is a significant evolutionary leap. Most of the time, evolution is just a matter of incremental, superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarity. And those tiers of similarity are what determine phylogenetic clades. But in rare instances, the change can be fundamental, as in this case. There are 2 important changes in the egg. One is that they're born with a shell. Well, what we call a shell anyway. The first eggshells were apparently like a layer of skin. Like if you peel a grape and then sit it on the counter and only the surface of it dries, leaving the liquid inside. That means that eggs laid in water that was too shallow will still be safe even if the water level drops. The other change is inside the egg. The amnion is a membrane that fills with amniotic fluid, which keeps the baby alive and moist throughout its development, even on dry land. The embryo lives out its tadpole stage inside the egg and only comes out when it's ready to crawl. These were apparently incremental developments, but these aspects of reproduction are not represented in fossils. Instead, we know from embryology that the amnion stems from the extraembryonic somatic mesoderm on the outer side and the extraembryonic ectoderm, or trypoblast, on the inner side. This is what frees land animals from ever having to return to the water for any reason other than to get a drink, which we still have to do quite often. On the side leading to amniotes, we have diadectomorpha, which are another set of transitional intermediates, reptiliomorphs that are more reptile than amphibian, but bearing a suite of diagnostic traits that are halfway between amniotes and amphibious or ancestral forms, meaning that although they look like reptiles, it's likely that they were born from gelatinous eggs, and that their embryonic stage was consequently lived out in the water as a tadpole. And finally, we move from the Carboniferous period into the Permian, and we get our first amniotes. The first division within that group is determined by holes that appear in the skull. Ancestral forms had no holes except for the eyes, of course, but they don't count that. We're looking behind the eyes. Synapsids had one hole in the temple, called a temporal fenestra, and this group eventually led to mammals. This feature closed up again in some modern forms, including apes like us, but there is still an impression of it in the sides of our skulls to show that it was once there. Diapsids eventually opened 2 holes in their skulls, and this is the group that leads to modern reptiles. But we're not there yet. We're still a few stages away. In the early Permian, every sauropsid that isn't synapsid was anapsid, meaning that their skulls don't have any extra holes in them yet. Now, I've already done a video on synapsids and the several transitional intermediates between reptiliomorphs and eventual mammals. So I want this video to introduce a new series that goes down the other road, to show the different clades of reptiles, because I like reptiles, and I think that would be fun. Now look at this. We went from reptiliomorphs to amniotes to sauropsids, becoming increasingly reptilian until we get to reptilia, meaning that everything after this point should be a reptile. Just as reptiliomorph means that it looks like a reptile, sauropsida means that it is like a reptile, except that it may include also stem groups, transitional reptiliomorphs that are almost but not quite reptiles. So who is the stem group in the side branch? Mesosaurs. They're described here as small aquatic reptiles. That's just lazy. If they're stem reptiles, then they're not reptiles. They're small aquatic sauropsids. Another way to put that is to say that they're parareptiles, meaning that they're on the side of reptiles. Because this is another one of those instances where the cladogram is incorrect. They misplaced parareptiles and have them here as if they were true reptiles. That's if you look at Wikipedia's listing for amniotes. If you look up parareptilia instead, then you'll get the right listing, at least for this group. Be sure to look up the one that is most up to date. You know, I like Wikipedia. I like the fact that it is the encyclopedia of everything, and that it is built and maintained by everyone, anyone. There are quality control corrections here or there. There are people who, check the figures and demand citations and whatnot. But the phylogenetic tree is a gargantuan, complex pattern that very few people barely understand. That's why you get discrepancies like this. And when I started the Phylogeny Explorer project a decade or more ago, it quickly became the largest cladogram ever constructed, at least regarding paleofauna. And it was pieced together by hand by a couple dozen volunteers working for hours every day for a few years, gleaning data from peer-reviewed sources, with the goal being that the project itself would ultimately be a peer-reviewed educational tool. But about the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, the database engineer then was Ukrainian. We haven't lost that data, but it's been offline ever since. And now we only have a couple computer volunteers working when they can in their spare time. Now, hopefully we'll get it back online and in its former glory, and I won't have to use Wikipedia anymore. If you know how to help with that, reach out. Looking at parareptiles, there again are the Mesosaurs, not to be confused with Mosasaurs. Mosasaurs were giant marine lizards, but Mesosaurs, meaning middle lizards, are not lizards at all. None of these things are lizards, are they? They just have that general look. And we have one word, one blanket term for any kind of reptile that has 4 legs and a tail. Nor are the Mesosaurs that they're supposed to be middle lizards, but they're not in the middle either, since they're right at the very beginning, even before the beginning of reptiles. What they are is the first or earliest example of terrestrial tetrapods readapting to life in the water. However, these are only known from the early Permian, so they didn't apparently make it very far. The next clade is Millerosauria. The last cladogram we looked at had this listed as Milleretidae, which are like little lizards again, but before there were lizards. We're still several stages away from the first real lizards. I don't even think we're going to get to them in this video. Milleretids apparently died out in the end Permian extinction. Why is this cladogram calling this Millerosauria now? Oh, because it's a composite clade that includes both Milleretidae and Eunotosauria. That's incorrect too. They put Eunotosaurus in the wrong place. Apparently this cladogram was based on old and outdated information. The next clade, Crocolophonidae, may look like a clade of bearded dragons or what my cowboy family used to call horny toads, but they're not. They're different on the inside where it counts. Skeletal details and the shapes of their teeth are different, but on the outside they look a lot like what we think of as lizards. Hardy ones too. Some of these managed to survive the end Permian extinction, popularly considered to be the worst extinction level event in geologic history, a calamity known as the Great Dying. Yet these little guys got through that somehow. Too bad they didn't make it through the next big extinction event at the end of the Triassic. One of their subgroups are pariasaurs. These didn't make it through the Great Dying, even though they were brutish beasts, heavily armored, with some as big as cattle and looking like shell-less turtles. In fact, for a century or so, it was thought that perhaps turtles were the last living anapsids. I wanted that to be true myself, because modern turtle skulls don't have any fenestra, so they could be anapsid. I wanted something ancient to still have some last survivors, rather than yet another massive clade gone entirely extinct at the end of the Permian, like practically everything else. As I understand it now, the oldest of all turtles, or perhaps the father of turtles, is Eunotosaurus. That is the thing that is incorrectly listed here with milleretids. It is now thought to be a shell-less turtle, where the ribs are already super wide, but they don't have that keratin shell on top of it yet. This was originally thought to be an anapsid. That's why this chart from 1988 had Eunotosaurus listed as an anapsid. Wait a minute. Anapsids as a separate group from parareptiles? Anapsids are parareptiles. And how can you be an anapsid, which is by definition basal to reptilia, yet be a subset of reptilia? Come on, man. Can we get a little consistency here? A detailed study of a juvenile Eunotosaurus revealed that it did have diapsid fenestra, which closed up in the adult forms. That means it is a diapsid, and thus a true reptile, not a parareptile. Genomic comparisons are normally very helpful, but not in this case, because we don't have DNA for any of the actual anapsids, since they're all extinct. All we could compare the DNA of turtles to was that of lizards, representing lepidosaurs, and crocodilians, representing archosaurs. The resulting studies flipped back and forth, indicating that turtles are roughly equally distant between lizards and crocs. Ultimately, it was derived synapomorphies that put the turtles in their place. Turtles have hard, brittle shells, just like crocodiles and dinosaurs, including birds, whereas lepidosaurs have soft, leathery shells. Thus, turtles and crocs and birds belong on the archosaur side of the reptile family tree. This chart assumes that parareptiles are a subset of reptiles in a sense, almost but not really, at least not when compared to eureptiles, the true reptiles. And this cladogram from 2022 doesn't have Eureptilia nor Reptilia either. Instead, it shows Neoreptilia, the new reptiles, without showing the old reptiles. And it jumps straight to Neodiapsidae, the new diapsids, without mentioning the old diapsids, which are somehow simultaneously the new reptiles. I'm open to be convinced if someone with expertise can defend this construct, but for the moment, I will take Reptilia to be the true reptiles until or unless otherwise indicated. Oh, and this is fun. This one has Eunotosaurus again, in a different place, this time as a diapsid, which it is, to be fair. But how is it listed here prior to the split between Lepidosauramorpha and Archelosauria, I ask you? I know it doesn't look like it in this image, but this is actually the deepest divide in the reptile family tree, at least with regard to however few major clades of reptiles are still alive today. Lizards, snakes, and the Tuatara are on one side, and the other side, here called Archelosauria, is a composite clade of both turtles and archosaurs, being both crocodilians and birds. Yes, birds are considered reptiles now because we figured out that they are the last living dinosaurs. If Eunotosaurus is linked to the crown of turtles, which I think is the leading position, if not the consensus, then it would have been excluded from Lepidosauramorpha to be part of Archelosauria. Let's look at it this way instead. On this chart we see Yonginiforms. They were historically suggested to be Lepidosauramorphs, but are currently thought to be basal non-saurian neodiapsids. In other words, they look like lizards, like most of these things do. They're not lizards, but they look like lizards, because everything does, except for Eunotosaurus. Look at Weigeltosauridae. They look like lizards too, but with ribs, or rather rib extensions, modified into gliding wings. See, there were some interesting things around back then. But what is between the regular-looking lizards and the gliding lizard? A proto-turtle. Eunotosaurus is out of place again, in a different wrong place this time. And just to be sure, I checked to update myself, make sure I'm not out of date. And while there was an article from a quarter century ago that said Unitosaurus was a parareptile, everything since 2013 indicates strong support for Unitosaurus as a critical transitional form in turtle evolution, in which case it doesn't belong here. Then we get into the next clade, Sauria. This is the main point of division for all reptiles that still exist today. Which side of this line are they on? Lepidosauramorpha, as I said, leads to actual lizards and snakes, as well as the Tuatara, which is the last living rhynchocephalian, and every other reptile or bird alive today is on that other side. Archelosauria is a composite clade of archosaurs. That's crocodilomorphs, phytosaurs, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, including birds. They are all archosaurs. And archosaurs are a sister clade to turtles and their extinct relatives. If the studies I saw from 2013, 2015, and 2016 are correct, that's where Unitosaurus goes. And if that one report from way back in Y2K is right, then it still wouldn't belong here, being classed as a neodiapsid. Neodiapsids are true diapsids, new diapsids, not parareptiles. So no matter who is right, this is wrong. Whether Unitosaurus is a stem turtle or not, we still know that at least this is where turtles evolved. And that's a fun story too, so let's at least look at that since we talked about it so much. Let's open up Pantestodines. Oh look! Unitosaurus is here too! How many different places is this one species going to be listed? Can we get some consistency? At least this time, for the first time, it's in the right place. Now let's look at the other things around it. Acerosodontosaurus is known only from a single skull, but it has features consistent with basal turtles, which is why they put it in Pantestodines. Claudiosaurus was probably aquatic, and from the look of these oversized feet, like turtles have, it probably swam and maybe even walked like a turtle, even though it was skinny. Unitosaurus is basically Claudiosaurus, but with broad expanded ribs bowing out the body, and obviously providing some defense against being crushed or punctured. Papacheles is another big-footed turtle-like pseudo-lizard with expanded ribs and a series of unconnected bones in the abdominal cavity, collectively called gastralia, which seem to be the precursors of an undershell, a chest plate, if you will. Eorhynchocheles is the same as Papacheles, except that it had a beak, and it lived in the Jurassic, so it's not in the transitional sequence that these others are. This one is just an offshoot. Odontocheles is basically the same thing as Papacheles, too, but it still had teeth and no beak. It also had a plastron replacing the gastralia. That's the bottom part of the turtle shell, the chest plate. If you want to know how these originally unconnected bones eventually fuse into a plastron, look at the plastron of Archelon, the largest turtle known to science. This one lived in the Cretaceous period, a long time before we're talking about, but it reveals a developmental pattern. Understand that between each of the spikes on the living animal was a relatively soft but still hardened area of keratin, which did not fossilize like the bony skeleton did. Now, just as the plastron has a bony foundation of gastralia, which is then fused into a bony plastron and then coated in keratin, so too was the carapace, the back part of the shell, based on a foundation of those widened ribs that we see on Unitosaurus and Papacheles. But even though we don't have fossils for the outside of this, we can reasonably expect that all that armor, the widened ribs, was probably not covered by soft, vulnerable, baby-smooth skin. It must certainly have had armor on top as well, like keratinized dermal nodes, like a lot of reptiles have, would have significantly improved this animal's armor until finally it grew a bony shell on the top of the ribs and below the keratin covering, as is here represented by Progonocheles, a true turtle and a complete turtle. It even had a beak and no teeth, just like modern turtles. Which is too bad in a way, because if it still had teeth and no beak, and maybe a pair of tusks, then it would have been my favorite turtle ever. Now, I've already done a playlist on the evolution of lizards and snakes, so I guess I'm done with Lepidosauramorpha. Now I want to focus on the several interesting divisions of Archosauramorpha. And since in this video we saw snakes that aren't snakes, maybe in the next video we'll look on the other side of Archelosauria at some turtles that aren't turtles.